Banjo Kazooie, one of the most iconic 3D platformers out there, and standing right next to Super Mario 64 in that category on the Nintendo 64. Geniusly developed by Rareware in 1998, and going on to becoming their flagship series. But Banjo Kazooie had a long development cycle that started out as an entirely different game before featuring fourth wall breaking animals, and even then had numerous aspects cut from it during development, whether it be levels, items, or even a whole stop and swap system that they had in mind. Today in this first part, we shall explore the history and beta unused content of Banjo Kazooie. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Rareware was a long-standing development company that had been developing games for Nintendo consoles since the days of the NES. Whether it be games including the ever-popular Donkey Kong Country series, Battletoads, and so much more. As such, the British team had acquired a strong profit and started to invest in Silicon Graphics workstations in building three-dimensional graphics. But this wasn't to build polygonal 3D games, but rather make high-quality, highly detailed 3D models to take snapshots of in order to produce sprites to use in two-dimensional games in place of pixel art. As a result, this was used for the ever-popular classic Donkey Kong Country in 1994. With the success of that game and its sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2, utilizing that technology, they wish now to utilize it for an entirely original Super Nintendo game. Splitting the team into two, one was set to develop a third Donkey Kong Country game. The other was to make a new original game, led by Rare's co-founder, Tim Stamper. The team sought to take influence from Japanese RPGs of the era, while also taking influence from the many adventure games produced by LucasArts, as well as The Legend of Zelda. As such came an idea to not make a platformer this time, and more an RPG, one that had more of a fantasy magic element to it, while giving it that Rareware spice. Codenamed Project Dream, and eventually Dream Land of Giants, a title to emphasize the fairy tale-like game they wish to produce, as well as it being a dream project for the team, this being a magnum opus to say, and was to take the very rendering they used for Donkey Kong Country to a whole new level. Being built in an isometric angle with side-scrolling elements mixed in, the game was to feature a character by the name of Edson, a simple human red-haired boy with a sword, fitting of any RPG, accompanied together with his dog Dinger, an AI-controlled dog who would perform a number of tasks including finding hidden objects for Edson. However, with how versatile he was to the protagonist, an idea was formed to merge both Edson and Dinger as a duo character the character would control at once, an idea that would stick with them down the road. The game was of course to take place in a medieval fantasy world with giants all around, including giant dinosaurs that would crush Edson. As the game progressed in development, one major request both Tim Stamper and designer Greg Mayles made was to incorporate music that the player wouldn't get sick of, while also giving the characters their own theme songs. Simultaneously at the company, a musician by the name of Grant Kirkhope had been recently hired to create music for GoldenEye 64. The two had a curiosity on Kirkhope in their search for a musician, so one day they asked to listen to his work so far on GoldenEye. With his ability to make so many variations of a single theme, as he was doing with the Bond theme, they absolutely loved his work. So much so that it led to them hiring Kirkhope to be the composer on Project Dream. However, the project was getting ambitious. Too ambitious for the dying SNES. Stamper wanted voice acting, and the game overall was getting too large to hold all these rendered images made for this game too, and so came the decision to restart development on Nintendo's upcoming console, the Nintendo 64. Being that this was an RPG, the early N64 carts were obviously going to be too small, as they typically came in 4, 8, and 12 megabyte carts. Thus, they decided to utilize the 64 disk drive to use a full 64 megabyte magnetic disk for this dream project. With development restarting, the team started to move away from the idea of a fantasy setting and instead go into more of a pirate-based story, an inspiration taken from Donkey Kong Country 2 in fact, and would look less childish in comparison. Edson was to stay however as the protagonist, and this time he'd be caught up in the affairs of a band of ragtag pirates led by Captain Black Eye. What these pirates were doing was searching for a substance called the Floaty to let them craft a flying ship to conquer other lands. Dinger was also set to return, and this time was presented as a dog that Edson would rescue, while staying as the other half of the playable characters. But several new characters were also being introduced. A girlfriend for Edson named Madeline, a friendly pirate named Captain Cockeye, along with more minor characters including Bully the Troll, a character named Tip Top, and the actual main antagonist of the game, who surprisingly wasn't Captain Black Eye, but rather the giant that they were planning for the Super Nintendo version. The game was now to be in a full isometric 3D, and with no side-scrolling section. Edson played mainly the same, but this time, he could also shoot fireballs out of his hands. The areas, however, had to be entirely remade and redone. While the jungle area from the SNES days was carried over in a way, it was completely different this time, being more open. But as well, there was now a beach and a town too. The pirate themes were clear too, being that skeleton pirates were around, while the RPG mechanics, such as treasure chests, were also available. In creating the levels, designer Greg Miles was doing this in a rather revolutionary manner, whereby he would lay out a flat polygonal floor and stretch the polygons to create the landscape as needed. This was, however, too demanding of the Nintendo 64 and was giving it frame rate problems. Even so, the game was progressing well to the point of voice lines even being recorded, including for Captain Black Eye, whereby special dialogue was recorded for it to be presented at the upcoming Nintendo 1996 Shoshinkai event in December.
So it's true then. The Nintendo 64 treasure does exist after all. Ha 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 ha! It's mine, all mine!
But this never came to be, as the game's problems were starting to kick in once again. It was too ambitious. As quoted, it was big and sprawling, and too much for the Nintendo 64 to handle. While the team was feeling demotivated, they soon especially felt it. One of the other teams at Rare had been working on the game Conker's Quest, featuring an animal protagonist, which played very well and was more akin to Mario 64. It was looking far better than Dream ever dreamed of being. Seeing this, they decided that they need to change the game up to play more like Conker, getting rid of the RPG mechanics and making it a platformer. But Tim Stamper felt that it was time for Edson to be retired. Not only were they already feeling that he was rather out of place in the middle of a pirate setting, but they also wished for an animal protagonist like Conker. Several ideas were being drafted now for this new animal buddy, including a rabbit in a suit, which lasted for about 3 days of development. But soon came the idea of an anamorphic bear with a backpack to the style of a Japanese school bag to keep any and all of his items found in-game, while also carrying a sword, much as Edson had. Soon, he had a second revision where he had a shirt, and instead of a sword, he had these giant claws, perfect for a bear. Immediately, everyone fell in love with this bear, and so Edson had officially been fired. While the bear was brought in, like the rest of the game, he was to also have full voice acting. As a result, the head programmer of Dream, Chris Sutherland, was asked to voice this goofy-looking bear. Already he was set to voice Edson, so his main character role stayed. But the bear was a swap out for Edson, to the point of where the plot point of the dog Dinger being rescued was given for the bear to do, which even had Chris Sutherland doing the voice for that section.
A dog! I could hear a dog down there. I better go and see if he's all right.
Even with being more of a platformer, even with Edson being replaced with a bear, the technical problems were all still there with how large the project was. Feeling that even if they did keep working on this, it would take many more years before completing it. As such came the idea to downsize the game into something more reasonable and lead to a complete restart of the game featuring this new bear protagonist. Having missed Shoshinkai where they wanted to present Project Dream, it was now 1997 and development was starting once more. In fact, Grant Kirkhope, who had already made a whopping 107 tracks for Dream, had to basically start over again. As his tracks were more suited for a more serious RPG, here he had to now stylize his music for a more goofy animal platformer. Some tracks did stay in place as placeholders until they were eventually replaced. A few of those tracks are as followed. Realizing that this RPG had taken them to far more ambitious and bigger ideas, more than the N64 could handle, they had scaled back this project to something more reasonable. Being that Rare was originally put on the map for side-scrolling platformers in the first place, they had decided to make just that, a platformer. This one being called Kazoo. Difference this time, of course, being that it would be in full 3D, utilizing the same game engine for Project Dream, and thus more of a 2.5D platformer, featuring this bear who could better utilize his abilities to traverse levels, which now the bear was given a name, the name Banjo. Banjo himself was now given another redesign, with him now wearing that backpack fully on his back, yellow shorts, sneakers, and a cap, basically as 90s fashion as it got. This was also to be paired with a skateboard to have a sort of moveset, which the idea with his clothes were that if he got hit, he'd lose his hat, then his shoes, and finally going fully dead at 3 hits. Of course, even in the 90s this was a cliched look, and no one liked it. And so he was just left with his shorts and bag. Though calling it a 2.5D platformer is very loosely used here, as the levels, while they had a linear path with branching paths around, gave the ability for Banjo to move around in a full 360 degrees of direction to explore the level and pick up fruit, an equivalent to the bananas that Donkey Kong would collect in his own games, attack enemies, and use one of the many branching paths. In fact, the game was much more starting to resemble Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation, which had released just a year prior. Let alone, just like that game, had Banjo traversing through a jungle level, a carryover from the Project Dream days, and the fruit collecting, which gave it an even bigger resemblance. Producer Tim Stamper, and now director Greg Mayles, wanted to include a major collectible in this game. Many platformers had a sort of collectible you can get, but 9 out of 10 times they were just for collecting, and not really useful in the long run. Mayle's desire was to have a collectible that would be useful, and so came the idea of these golden jigsaw puzzles called Jiggies, that you'd collect 5 in each level and utilize to open up new worlds via a picture you'd complete. Let alone the fruit collecting would also be used for redeeming Jiggies. Meanwhile, the game still would have more standard collectibles too, in the form of creatures called the Jinjo that Banjo would collect along the way. Originally, these guys would try to run away from Banjo and were intentionally gonna be hard to get, but later changed to be more stationary and even whistling to get Banjo's attention. And during the process, a large number of enemies were crafted for this game. Some crudely drawn, some actually built into the game. You got nasty squirrels, nasty plants, Mr. Mole, a kangaroo, 3 varieties of snails, which the base one did make it in. Same goes for these bull enemies called Bully, which would survive to the end, as well as a crab named Crabbo, which would also survive into the final game. There was also an electric eel, a hyena, a sleeping tiger, a leash dog named Ripper, a greedy pig, a fat bird that would stomp on Banjo, another bird enemy called Bombird who would fly live bombs to Banjo, and another bird enemy named Beaky who would steal Banjo's then cap, like a certain other platformer. There was also going to be the Stinky Kirky the skunk that would chase Banjo, one-shot him with his stench, along with a bear enemy called Jekyll and Hyde who transformed into his meaner self and also chased Banjo. And then there were some more mythical monsters too, including a Medusa-looking enemy that would freeze Banjo, a thief goblin that would steal Banjo's fruit, a 2-headed ogre, and a Cyclops. And then we got these that would be disguised as harmless objects, including Mr. Bush, Mr. Tree, Mr. Box, Mr. Signpost, and Mr. Strawberry, including with this one mushroom foe that was directly programmed in, called Mr. Helmet. As well, there was another strange one called Mr. Multiply that would create copies of itself to fight, along with a camouflage enemy called Chameleon Man to ambush Banjo. There was also another enemy called Bully, who was not a bull like the earlier ones, and this one would shake Banjo down for his fruits. Then there was one called Boomerang Thrower, and an enemy that would blow itself on Banjo called Bomb Master. Then there were two enemies involving boulders, Boulder Pusher, that would push a boulder to roll over and crush Banjo, and one called Boulder Rider, that would instead bowl a boulder to Banjo. Then there is Mr. Tentacle, who looks to be an octopus-like enemy that would sweep at Banjo, as well as an enemy with a massive club called Big Club, who was also dumb enough to even be lured to hit other enemies, along with a proposed boss fight too, who would grow larger and larger with each hit. The idea being that the more you feed him, the more he would grow and then explode. There's also a large robot too called Robokong, which could very well have been another boss fight. We also got a wizard who would transform Banjo into something else, which wasn't specified, whether it was one that would impede or help Banjo, a feature a prominent character later on would receive to Banjo's advantage. And in contrast, we got this more unique enemy, this witch enemy, that would turn Banjo into a frog, an enemy that would become much more prominent later in development. Now to tackle these enemies, Banjo's means of fighting were with his claws and jumps, while also being quite acrobatic with his ability to backflip. And taking inspiration from Donkey Kong Country's barrel attacks, Banjo was going to instead use sports balls to attack enemies, such as bowling balls across the ground, or a basketball, and even a water balloon. But even more flexible, whereby he could even use a soccer ball, a football that would go diagonally, a baseball glove to throw baseballs, or even a baseball bat to hit a baseball at an enemy. But the team, seeing how acrobatic Mario was, they wanted to make Banjo even more flexible. As such, they wanted Banjo to double jump. But this was rather ridiculous for a bear to do, so as such, they wanted to give him something that would instead assist him to do just that. Being a rather challenging concept, much brainstorming took place at Rare, but soon they came up with a desperate solution. A pair of wings would grow out of Banjo's backpack to let him do a second jump. With that, the idea grew for the backpack to also sport a pair of legs that would come out to let Banjo fast travel, but putting two and two together, the team realized that this simply would mean that another character actually would be living in Banjo's backpack, which would have it of course be a bird to fit that description. And so they decided to make this another character that would be accompanying Banjo, going back to the original idea of Project Dream of a dog that accompanied the protagonist. This bird was being designed to be a complete contrast to Banjo, being made red, given a rather sharp-tongued personality, while also being a girl, given the name of Tweeter. And with Tweeter added to the mix, Banjo's moveset expanded quite a bit. Of course, the double jump was given a name now, called the Tweeter Flap, later renamed as Feather Flap, that initially had a much bigger jump to it, with a long descent, eventually shortened by quite a bit, but as well as new moves, including Tweeter Nip, where she'd poke forward while Banjo faced the other way, to the Rat-a-tat Rap, and Banjo would be facing the same direction. There was also a rather vulgar one too, whereby she'd be shooting eggs from her rear, called Tweeter Shit. You can tell why this was changed with this E rating that they wanted. These, along with even full flying abilities and the beak barrage, where Tweeter would lunge forward to attack an enemy. Initially, it required Banjo and Tweeter to position themselves before the lunge could happen. Soon that delay was removed, and could be done nearly instantaneously and with a greater reach, with Tweeter extending her neck. And while Tweeter later in development would carry her sharp tongue, here she was a lot meaner, going as far as to even, and I quote, shits in backpack and sticks head out to laugh. And at this point, the models of Banjo and Tweeter were more or less finalized, but still lacked a lot of textures. Soon her wings were given feathered textures, while Banjo's shorts received some crease textures to go with it. Meanwhile, despite the game changing quite a bit from Project Dream, it still carried over much of the world and the story of the game. This including the main villain still being the sea pirate, Captain Blackeye, which would lead to a world of 10 islands that Banjo and Tweeter would traverse, including 32 levels. This would include the jungle, the beach, temple, water, mine, fantasy, swamp, a spooky landscape, a lava area, an ice world, and a desert level, including several locations to visit, including a factory, a big city, an Eskimo camp, a bear cave, and an oasis caravan. The jungle level, that has been seen a fair bit so far, had the objective of traversing from one end of the mountain to the other. Meanwhile, the beach level, which would be level 2, would have several branching paths leading to a more open-ended level, with tides changing the enemies in the area. Objectives including gathering 15 shells. There was also an idea involving scaling a giant tree, which was something seen in previous Donkey Kong Country games too. Meanwhile, the friendly pirate, Captain Cockeye, was still around and with a lookout available to visit. While it also can be argued that Banjo and Tweeter were the replacements of Edson and Dinger, it can also be argued that there was now also a new replacement for Edson's girlfriend Madeline, in the form of a female bear called Piccolo, who was to be Banjo's girlfriend, even carrying Madeline's theme song still. One of the few tracks that Kirkhope had written for Dream that was kept in place temporarily. Have a listen. With 2 months in, and having made strong progress, it was now spring 1997. With Super Mario 64 out and about, Nintendo had Rareware take a good hard look at Super Mario 64 and how it played. Director Greg Mayles, looking at it closely, realized that they had been working with what looked rather old in appearance. 2D gameplay like Kazoo here just wasn't something that would interest gamers as much anymore in his view. It was like clearly our technology looked really old in comparison, and literally overnight we just thought that's gonna be the future of what 3D games are gonna look like. It was there that Greg Mayles and producer Tim Stamper decided that the game needed to be rebooted once more, and this time going 100% into the third dimension, gameplay wise. And so a week later, everything was scrapped. The graphic engine was retooled for full 3D development, and overall starting to retool everything for this new take on this long project, now being titled as Banjo Kazooie, a project that would start to chart the game on its final course. Next time, with a clear direction on the road, the team now works to transition many of their ideas from that 2.5D game to their full 3D incarnation, going through much evolution on stage building, many cut ideas, and even a whole stop and swap system that they were planning in conjunction with future games that they were planning to build. So make sure to hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Banjo and Kazooie and other gaming history and cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you'd want to have played any of these lost builds. So everyone, thank you for watching.